Good morning.
Hi, good morning. How are you doing?
Still sick, but much better.
All right, okay, that's great. I know that there is a change in weather here as well, so obviously precaution and sudden drop in temperature. It started to become quite cold quite quickly. So a lot of
Yeah, I heard my friend told me as well. I just traveled for a short vacation to those ends to Europe. So the weather changed. It was raining and cold. So yeah, came back really sick. It really got me bad.
good stuff. So get well soon. That's what I can say.
Thank
You'll have to
you.
take, obviously these patterns which happen throughout the year, which is predominantly when weather and seasons change. Sometimes we can be affected because
Yes.
of sudden changes in temperature, and obviously we always lag behind in terms of oh, the winter clothes have to come out now, and the summer clothes have to go back in. And sometimes in the offices, when you have AC and other bits still running at full blast, assuming that it's still summer, that what
Hmm.
tends to get you quite often.
Yeah, that's the problem I face here since I'm the summer baby in Dubai.
Okay, good stuff. So
Yeah.
we are going to be looking at, a new unit today with yourself
Hmm.
specifically, because on the healthcare, there will be some bit of changes that you will see on your side of the
Yeah.
course. There are certain different units. So obviously, we'll have to do and get you to attend some of these sessions with us, on some of the different units. Now, the
Okay.
unit that we're going to look at on Moodle, essentially, I don't know whether you've gone in and seen, but on Moodle, you will have two other units which have come before this, which is, if I just briefly show that to you as well. So on the Moodle, you'll probably have structure and overview of health and social care sector, and then you'll
Hmm.
also have principles, values, regulation in healthcare sector. Now, what the ATHE has done is basically they've launched this refreshed version of the qualification, and in some of the units, what they've done is they've split the units up into smaller credits because they've updated the content. So a few units are 5 or 8 credits, some of them are 10 credits, and some of them are 15 credits. So in your
Ah,
case,
okay.
your course you're looking at doing, which used to be the 4 unit course, has now become a 6 or a 7 unit course.
Okay.
The content of it predominantly remains the same, but there is an addition of 1 or 2 units like the one that we are going to do today, which is human growth and development, and
Mm-hmm.
then the addition of the personal and professional development in health and social care. So these 2 units generally, are human growth development is a part of nursing.
Mm-hmm.
And personal and professional development pretty much, because in that sector, health and social care, we tend to have what is called a lot of development in terms of training and development, which tends to happen because you need to always be having current skills, or
Yes, to date.
acquiring new skills to do your job quite well.
Mm-hmm.
So in those cases, you will predominantly be looking at this particular unit, which is the personal PPD, as we call it, personal and professional development. And obviously in health and social care sector will be just like a lag on add on text towards the end of each unit. So basically the units are research, PPD, you have working in health and social care, human and growth development, you have principal values and regulations, which is pretty much the person-centered approach unit. But in this case, what we have focused on is most of the legislation and regulation which is in this sector. And then
Mm-hmm.
structure and overview of health and social care sector is basically about the structure of NHS and how the healthcare department typically work in any country. So most of the qualification was very UK centric, and a lot of learners are taking up this qualification internationally. So some of the units have actually been journalized, in the sense that the namings of the unit and the way they are called have essentially been changed.
Hmm.
So when you look at the newer version of this particular course, which is looking at 6 units, in this case, what you're looking at is some of the units which were in the previous version of the course, like health and social care sector, was pretty much focused on National Health Service or only the UK. But the structure and overview of health and social care sector would mean that you're basically broadly understanding, how most of the healthcare departments or healthcare ministries actually work, across the globe. And similar is the case with person-centered approach unit, which has now become principles, values, and regulations. So there are lots of regulations in different countries on health and social care in terms of, let's say, how care is to be delivered, who is eligible for care, what are the basic minimum care requirements which the government provides, typically at the time of birth, after that in adolescence for children, and then you look at adults and mature adults. So that part would be regulation, things like health and safety, things like Mental Health Act, things like Health and Social Care Act, things in the UK, obviously, you have the NHS Act, some of the main bodies that you will be looking at studying. And understanding how they regulate the developments of, care being provided under this banner of, health and social care sector within various countries. So it's a bit of a generalization across some of these units. Now, the Human and Growth Development Unit is predominantly being introduced as a new unit. So that is why we will do this separately. This unit focuses mostly on understanding the basic biology side of things, which is when you start to look at picking up life sciences, or you go towards medicine, or you are going towards nursing in particular, or in health and social care. There is where we need to understand the early years of development of childhood. So essentially from the aspect of conception to adulthood is what we will be looking at, predominantly studying in this particular unit. And this unit is mostly focused on understanding, some part of it is purely theoretical, because you'll be looking at understanding PIEs, as we call it, which is the 4 stages of development, which are identified, pretty much by all bodies. And they would essentially be focused on, you understanding the PIEs, PIES milestones. And they would generally be focused on, essentially things like the early, stages of your childhood. We'll be looking at understanding also, how a child goes from being a child to, and goes through childhood first, then obviously goes through, what are the various 4 different stages in any cycle of growth, which is predominantly physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. That is what PI stands for. So essentially, we'll be looking at studying this concept of PIEs in terms of how does the growth happen physically, emotionally, intellectually, and socially across various age groups. And that would start with early years, which is predominantly from 0 to say 3 years. Then we look at childhood, which is 4 to 9 years. Then we look at adolescence, which is taking, and talking about it from a point of view of the after 9 years into say puberty, teenage, and then going up to about the age of 19, where you are basically then becoming a mature adult. And then when we look at 20 to 65, which is the adulthood, and then 65 and beyond, which is old age in particular, and those areas is what we want to understand and relate to how care has to be provided when we look at these 4 different stages through which people go through. And each level and each stage at which this care is provided tends to be very different when we are dealing with it. So a bit of a knowledge and a background unit for people who are looking at studying health and social care in particular, because if they have no idea or background on the health and social care sector in particular, this unit would help you understand a bit of biology and science around it in terms of how care needs to be tailored and obviously provided at these 4 different major milestones which everybody goes through in terms of their age. Now, in this unit, we are going to be looking at predominantly 4 learning outcomes. So there'll be 4 or 5 sessions that we'll be looking at doing. This unit, as I would say, is only 5 credits. As you can see, they've reduced the credits of some of the units in some places, but the content part of it, has pretty much remained quite detailed. So even with 5 credits, you're still expected to cover a lot of ground in terms of learning outcomes and the indicative content which has been given. So this unit will, as you would see, that most of the learning outcomes here are no. That means knowledge based. Understand, pretty much you're looking at just theoretically understanding, most of the concepts which are covered in the learning outcomes. So there's a bit of reading in this particular unit, and in places wherein, during when we discuss it with presentation, in places I would essentially, say that go about and read this article or go about and read this particular, say, for example, an extract from a website. And the reason of doing that would be to try and get you some information and more detailed knowledge, because the more you read, the more you would understand in terms of how, people go through the various stages of development, or how human particularly, go through the human stages of development. And we are looking at focusing throughout the unit on the concept of, in the first 2 learning outcomes, we're essentially looking at, this particular understanding from a point of view of infancy to late adulthood. And in the third and fourth learning outcome, we are going to be focused on a bit of what is called the person-centered approach, the 6 principles of care. We'll be looking at how this person-centered approach came about, and then also looking at focusing on understanding, how care is provided, both in the terms of health and social care sector, and in the case of, let's say, mental health care, which is required to be provided when people are in the late adulthood stage of their life. So it's a combination of 2 units, which I would put it this way. There's a lot of content for a 5 credit unit, but we will have to, go through it in terms of theoretically understanding some part of it. And because most of the learning outcomes are know or understand, that would mean that you're not practically required to, do most of it, but it is to build your knowledge and understanding on some of the key concepts, theories, and obviously models, which will be useful for you to build your background on the knowledge of, human and growth development, various stages of human growth and development. And they would essentially be from infancy to late adulthood. So today's session is going to be focused on understanding the stages and growth of development throughout the human lifespan. So there are stages that we will look at. Obviously, scientists divide them into 6 or 9 different parts, but we'll be generally looking at 4 broad stages in order to understand, what are the phases through which people go through. When I say people, I mean, humans would go through in terms of developing from being a child into an adult, and obviously looking at, late adulthood. Now, some of the tasks in this particular, learning outcome would focus on basically describing or just getting an understanding of each of these in terms of, what could be the physical, emotional, intellectual, and social developmental stages which are identified in each of these 4 blocks that we say: childhood, adolescence. We look at adulthood, and then late adulthood. And then what we also want to do is graphically try and identify some of the key changes which happen in the child when you're going through these stages. So what does puberty mean? What does a being a teenager mean? What kind of development a child goes through when they are, from the conception stage to essentially up to the age of 3 or 4 years, wherein the child is continuously growing, focused on more of getting sleep, and, essentially brain is developing, the body is developing. And then the same process continues, but from a point of view of pies, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development, that tends to change as we go into these 4 broad stages. So that is what we will be needing to understand in terms of the key changes which happen at each of these individual stages during the period of growth and development from child to the adulthood. And then the idea would be to try and understand some of the development norms and milestones. What is it that the industry or the fraternity understands? So when you are a clinic or a medic, how do you understand these norms and milestones? So why do we look at classification of this being children, that they will get medication between 0 to 3 years? This has to be taken into account. Or when we look at children from the age of, say, 4 to 9, and then look at, so the idea here is to try and draw up a bit of a timeline showing different milestones during the phase of this particular development. And the analysis part of it, which is the merit task, is basically going to be looking at this whole cycle. But what we will be needing to do is primarily understand how each of these stages have an impact on each other. So here again, when we talk about childhood, how does it impact in the initial years of you being a child, and how you're, say for example, getting nutrition, how you're being fed, how you're growing up, which place or which atmosphere, external environment in which you're growing up, how does it shape your childhood? Or from your childhood, how does it shape your say the adolescence side of things, and how does it shape your adulthood? So we'll be looking at the interrelationship between the stages through which humans go through in terms of development, but how does each of that stage have a bearing on the development of the individual in the next stage is also key and is important. So for example, if children get good nutrition in the early years and they are looked after quite well, just as a broad example, they would generally be more healthy. They will be less prone to get catching diseases or having problems in the adulthood. And in some cases, it will also mean that if you've had good upbringing during the early years, where in terms of you've had balanced meals, nutrition, things like that, that would also mean that physically, if I look at, maybe the individual could be having a good physique, a good structure, maybe good height, and a general well-being in terms of being healthy. But people sometimes, if children sometimes don't get good nutrition in the early years of their life, something that we also see is advocated that breastfeeding is important in the early years up to between 0 to 3, and this helps the child in its development in terms of being more immune to common illnesses and diseases, makes bones healthy, and obviously the mental development of the child tends to be much more quicker and faster and healthier if if children are fed breast milk initially, because it is considered to have all the vital ingredients which the baby requires essentially in the initial years to grow into a healthy individual. And those are the bits that we will need to understand when we talk about how each of the developmental areas, the 4 broad types that we talk about, have a bearing on each other. So this is again going to be a bit of a detailed reading, because here the analysis would be done by taking up a particular example, and that example would basically be focused on not covering what we've done in task 1 to 1.3, but will be basically using the example to explain how this has an impact when we talk about the development of the child from one stage to the other, and its bearing onto an effect and bearing onto the other different stages as we pass through and grow and obviously go through that particular stage. So quite a lot of content in the first learning outcome itself to cover, and what we're going to be looking at is starting off with a bit of a discussion on the broad concepts of it first. And that is where I think what I would look at is primarily, showing you a bit of a video first, because I think this video will look at summarizing nicely in terms of what are the various stages through which we grow from conception to adulthood, and how each of these stages are important from a point of view of development throughout, our human lifespan. So the idea there is to broadly, I would say, understand this from the video first, and at a later stage, what we will do is when we start discussing individual criteria, we are going to be focused on obviously getting into a bit more nitty-gritty and details of what these phases are and how we go through the various phases of growth and development. So this is the indicative content that we are looking at covering. The broad, bold headlines 10 will be the individual tasks that we are looking at. So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1M1. And within that, we'll be looking at covering some of the content which has been given as a steer in terms of what needs to be covered to understand, broadly the learning outcome one, which is know these stages of growth and development throughout the human, lifespan. Now, let's look at this particular video in general, which I want to kind of, focus on, because this nicely, sets in and obviously describes, the various phases through which, growth and development of human lifespan happens. So let me just bring this video up on the browser, and then we will look at going through this. So let me just shift you over.
Have you ever brought home a new pup?
Okay, let me just share the screen first. So that's the one. And then let's watch this particular video. So are you able to see the screen?
Yes, I see it.
All right, that's great.
Puppy and then watched it grow up? How did your dog change as it got older? You may have watched your dog grow and develop from a cute and cuddly puppy to a bit of a troublemaker, to a confident companion, and finally to a lazy old dog who sleeps all day. Each of these stages has different physical and emotional characteristics. Just like dogs, humans go through different developmental stages in their life as well. Typical human development is a pretty predictable process. Most humans develop at similar rates. This pattern of development allows us to make generalizations about different stages, such as infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Let's take a closer look at each stage. Infancy, typically the first year of life, is the first important stage of human development. Many physical milestones occur during this stage as an infant gains control over its body. However, infants must rely on others to meet most of their needs. They learn to trust other people as needs are met. They need to feel this security in order to properly develop, both physically and emotionally. Like your puppy, an infant needs to be loved and nurtured. As you met the needs of your puppy, he or she learned to trust and bond with you, while he or she also developed physically. The next stage of human development is childhood, during which children start to explore and develop a sense of independence. Eventually, children learn to make their own decisions, and they discover that their actions have consequences. As they learn and grow, they develop a sense of self. Children need to be nurtured so that they develop self-confidence instead of self-esteem issues. Achieving a healthy level of self-confidence helps children stay motivated to achieve. A child also needs guidance as they begin to test out new skills and gain confidence in their decision-making. Do you remember when your puppy got big enough to start getting into things? You may have had to make sure to put your shoes up, or your dog would chew them as he or she was learning what he or she should and shouldn't do. During childhood, children begin to develop a sense of self and independence, and this process continues in the next stage of human development. During adolescence, young men and women are primarily concerned with finding their identity and expressing who they are in the world. Puberty causes many physical changes to take place, and adolescents must adapt to their changing bodies. All of these changes can make adolescence a confusing and stressful period. As adolescents try to find their place, they may experiment with different roles and make attempts to separate from authority figures. They are getting used to their bodies and trying to find out where they belong. They may try out different hairstyles and hobbies in an attempt to create an image of themselves they're comfortable with. Eventually, your puppy wasn't really a puppy anymore. He or she was growing into a dog. He or she probably became a bit rebellious too and tested your authority from time to time. As you set firm and consistent rules, your puppy became comfortable with his or her personality and place in your home. Your overgrown puppy is very much like an adolescent. Adulthood brings on even more new challenges and major decisions about school, career, and home life. Early adulthood involves few physical changes, but it's a time of important emotional development as young adults decide where they want to live, who they want to live with, and what type of work they want to do. Next comes middle adulthood, or middle age, when adults begin to deal with the physical signs of age, wrinkles, gray hair, and maybe a few extra pounds. On top of physical changes, most middle-aged adults also experience stress from dealing with older children and taking care of aging parents. Most adults have the life experience and emotional stability to deal with these challenges, but it's no wonder we use the term midlife crisis for those who struggle with this period of human development. Late adulthood, or old age, comes with its own unique set of physical and emotional challenges related to aging. On the one hand, late adulthood offers senior discounts and often comes with fewer responsibilities. But on the other hand, it also brings more health concerns. As their bodies wear out, people face the reality that they'll not be around forever. Older adults are also at risk for loneliness and depression if they lose the activities and people that provided them with meaning in their lives. It's important that family and social ties are maintained during this period of life. Ultimately, adulthood stretches over many years of a person's life, and it's the time in which we settle into our place in the world, raise our families, and enjoy the benefits of belonging. Once your puppy is fully grown, he or she settles in as an important, confident member of the family who moves through his or her own adulthood substages before becoming that lazy old companion your family has grown to love. Becoming an adult and moving through the substages of this period of human development is sort of like this, except people have far more responsibilities and may not be as lazy as some old dogs.
So as you can see, this primarily gives you a bit of a gist of summary in terms of how we go through different stages, of development. And this is important in a way. It provides, in a nutshell, in terms of a summary of how we look at different stages through which we develop as humans. So I think a good analogy there taken was, for the dog, in terms of when you get a companion, and it starts off being, you bring hold a puppy which is 6 to 8 weeks old, and then how it goes through various stages in terms of its growth and development, adjusting with the family, and obviously becoming a part and parcel of your daily lives as a member of the family. So similarly, you go through different phases, and these are identified as broadly 4 basic types: infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. But obviously, when we look at do a deeper analysis in terms of what would be these different phases, we would primarily identify them into either 6, in some cases 8, and even in some cases 9 different types. And depending on how detailed we want to look at each phase in terms of human lifespan and growth and development, we would primarily look at bringing them down into different stages in terms of how life is conceived, and obviously from there growing up to into a individual, mature adult, late adulthood, which is essentially old age. Now, with this broad understanding, what we want to be able to do is step into some of the assessment criteria, and here it talks about describing the PIEs, which is physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development of humans in particular during these each key 4 stages of our growth. Now, we can essentially divide them into 4, 8, or 4, 6, or 8. But essentially, what I have done for the purposes of the presentation, not to make it too detailed and obviously focused on in terms of the 4 areas that we want to look at, I have kind of divided them into 4 broad areas. Though in some of the slides I've captured things like starting with how life comes into being, which is conception, then looking at pregnancy in general, then we look at birth, We look at infancy, which is the first stage that we want to focus on, and then go on and discuss some of these factors related to PIEs. So there are some areas that I've gleaned from the internet and some books, primarily because they help us summarize some of these key phases of development to study, which is basically physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. And they are across these four broad areas in terms of what we go through as humans when we are growing up. Now, in terms of looking at these four broad areas, what we want to be able to focus on first is understanding what is intellectual. So when we talk about intellectual in particular and intellectual development in particular, what we are looking at primarily focusing on is, understanding intellect point of view, which is basically relating to your brain, how children would develop essentially or react to some sort of a stimulation. And in this case, how our brains are essentially developing. So when we talk about normally the concept of looking at development from a point of view of intellectual and use the word intellectual, here we are looking at interesting in understanding primarily the logic rather than the feelings. So in terms of your brain function specifically, and that would be looking at classifying you as, are you interested in getting into the concepts in a bit more detail, or are you an intellectual person? Sometimes we say that, or do you like to challenge yourself to read a bit more and gather more information? And all this is basically related to the ability of how we look at functioning or measuring our functions from a point of view of our brain activity. Now, intellectually, when we talk about development, we generally see that babies tend to grow quite quickly. And most of the organs of our body in general are growing at a very fast pace when we are growing up as humans. So when we look at from the time of our birth to the age of 3, you generally see most of your physical features actually growing, and they also include the development of brain. And as a child, you will start to develop, essentially the basic 5 senses, which is seeing, touching, feeling. And those kind of senses tend to be related to intellectual stimulation, or your brain actually understanding how some of these, signals that we get from the external environment, from people, tend to, help us understand how to react. So one of the things that we have all experienced and have seen is that if you bring your hand over the candle or a burning candle, you generally get a reflex, and then you pull your hand away or your finger away because you feel the warmth and you feel that it is going to burn. So this is a reflex which and some of these kind of reflexes your brain learns through the use of sensory touch, obviously the 5 senses that we have, and they would help develop intellectually the brain and its activity to be able to understand and then get into the place wherein you are able to make and take decisions that this is something which is going to be okay, this is something which is going to be harmful. And that part of the thing that we talk about in terms of development tends to be the intellectual side of things. Now, when we talk about emotional, now we will be looking at, essentially understanding all these stages of development, predominantly through these 4 broad areas: intellectual, emotional, social, and, physical. So when we look at each of this particular phase through which, growth and development happens in humans, would typically be from a point of view of looking at, so this is going to be looking at primarily from a point of view of looking at, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and then, early, middle, and late adulthood. So when we in general talk about these 4, we will be focusing on, these 4 broad areas, which is looking at how physical development is happening, how intellectual development is happening, emotional development is happening, and social, and factors which are going to socially affect, and obviously how it will affect our social development from a point of view of human and growth development when we study these 4 broad stages. So emotional means related to your emotions, person's emotions, and they would generally be characterized by feelings. So here, the emotions that in the initial first stage, which is primarily infancy to early childhood, you'd be looking at developing emotions, which will primarily be things like love, fear, anger. You'd be looking at, also understanding how to basically work with your senses and how to experience these emotions. So when we look at early childhood and the bonding which happens between the newborn baby and the mother, it generally tends to be the communication skills, which the baby is not able to communicate, but the things that you look at, which is when a baby cries, for example, we generally understand that, okay, either the nappy is wet or the baby is hungry. And in some cases, the initial reflexes tend to be that, okay, maybe we might need to turn over the baby slightly. There is maybe wind in the, in the belly, and then you look at giving gripe water and things like that. And those areas which we look at are basically emotional bonding areas, wherein the child, from the time of birth to the months, say 0 to 9 months, or a year or so before the toddler starts to, make chuckling sounds, giggling sounds, starts to, get on the feet, is basically where a lot of emotional bonding happens between the mother and the child. And that tends to be through the, that helps essentially the baby understand basic set of emotions, which are around love, fear, and anger. Now, we also look at, the social aspect of it. Physically, we understand that the baby is going through, various phases of development. And this chart, basically, in the initial part of it that we want to understand, summarizes it quite well. So physical movements and developments tend to be, the child starts to move around, turn around, maybe at a latest stage, when they're closer to, beyond 6 to 9 months, when we look at, they start to, kind of take support and start standing up. So these are all types of physical developments which will start to happen. And they've been nicely summarized in this particular side of the table, wherein if you look at 6 months, the baby starts to roll over in both directions. In 9 months, the baby starts to stand with a bit of support, crawls, on the knees with the hands, starts to pull things across. And at 12 months, you would generally see that they use some sort of a support to be able to start walking, take a few steps, and then they are able to stand on their own. And this is what generally would be seen in the physical part of the development. Now, when we talk about social development, obviously there are bits and pieces wherein sometimes you see during various phases of this initial growth, you would see that babies get scared of loud sounds, they start crying. They essentially would look at, sometimes one of the most common things that we've seen is if you have seen a young, very, newborn or a baby, when they are able to recognize in 3 to 6 months and have, are able to see and recognize, they would generally smile and chuckle when they are in the hands of their mother. If they go into somebody's hands and you pick them up and they don't recognize or don't like the person, they immediately make face. Or you would generally see that also if sometimes children are in front of the mirror, they see a reflection of themselves and they haven't seen that before. And because it's the first time they are experiencing that as an emotion, some babies get frightened and they start crying. So there are lots of these type of things is what is related to the social and emotional side of things that we need to understand, that in the initial years from infancy, you would generally see these trends and developments happening from a point of view of how the baby would go through, the growth and development during the infancy and the early years of childhood stage. Then we look at summarizing this same 4 areas broadly: physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development from a childhood perspective, years 4 to 9. So infancy, from the time of conception to birth and up till the age of years 3, we would look at, classifying that infancy. Then we would go into something which is a second phase that we want to understand, which is childhood. So here, what are the physical changes which are typically happening? For example, we use the word called motor skills. That means the child's body and muscles are essentially at this stage developing quite rapidly. And you would generally see that children are much more active and physically they want to, they are physically more active. They start to take on activities like walking backwards, climbing stairs, jumping. So you generally see parents get hold of trampolines or, small other kind of, toys which would increase and, let's say, promote their physical activity. They start to play in ball games. Those kind of things start to happen when we talk about physical development. Their height tends to increase. One of the key things that we will start in looking at in this stage is that you would see humans and children essentially would start to develop, and because their bones are growing and the body structure is increasing, the body mass is increasing, the muscles are increasing, you would generally see that the height tends to increase in this particular phase. Then we talk about, say, for example, intellectual phase. Again, here we are looking at children going to school, primary, essentially. They start, taking their first step towards getting into some sort of schooling. So we would look at children going into primary, and up until the age of 9, you would generally see the child, growing and studying from a primary school. Within primary, say year 1 to up to year 4 or year 5, depending on, what time they go into nursery. But most cases, children from age 4 onwards till age 9 would essentially be in schooling at some stage. And that would involve they having to now pick up skills which are going to be related to understanding their surroundings, differentiation in terms of colors, learning to play music, other physical activities, which could be games. And it would also relate to helping them develop their, language skills in particular. And you would generally see that this is happening primarily during the phases wherein children get into schooling, and intellectually their brain activity and other sort of things start to develop when they start to receive schooling at this age, starting from primary at the age of 4 and going up to the age of 9, which will generally be year 5, year 4 or year 5. Now, emotionally, if I look at the same stages of development, you are going to be looking at here, the children become conscious of their gender, whether I'm a boy or a girl. They will be looking at understanding, and developing interest and habits towards their own side of, their personality in terms. Sometimes you would generally see that girls tend to be more docile, more sober, boys tend to be more extrovert, more loud and more aggressive. And these are traits that are generally going to be developed. And obviously they will develop a bit of self-awareness in terms of looking at understanding what are their emotions, how do they relate to these emotions, what kind of activities they do, and how they feel certain things or look at certain things. When they look at them, they feel either excited, they openly display their excitement, or basically becoming a bit more self-aware at this stage. And some of them also start to develop things like a sense of humor. They are able to control their feelings, and in some cases they are also going to be looking at developing, say, for example, certain types of feelings which they would be more openly expressing. In some cases you have strong feelings, when they would be open to expressing those feelings, and this would then be looking at making them more self-aware of in terms of how they become happy, how they become sad. Are they afraid in certain situations? Are they lonely in certain situations? And what cheers them up? And in some cases, you're looking at understanding they taking a bit of help from adults to go through this particular aspect of understanding that why am I experiencing this, or why am I having this as a feeling, or so this is where the questioning side of things starts to happen when we look at the emotional and the development of brain related activity. The social aspect of that being that you tend to get along. In the early childhood, it's more about knowing yourself, and obviously the children getting along with each other. This is to do with they don't have any fallacies at this stage in terms of understanding who they are working with, how they are playing, or where they are, and in what environment they are. But they're generally interested in obviously mingling and playing at this stage, and then being in the company of others in the similar age group, which allows them to be social. And in this case, it is all about, to a certain aspect, if I say it's all about having fun, because in the early years of your development, being a child, there are no areas, no responsibilities, and obviously no areas wherein, it is more of, let's say, um, going through, even in school, um, things and generally understanding and increasing your awareness. There is no expectation at this stage that the children would need to be able to do this or take exams. And from that point of view, it is more about just their development, and the social aspect tends to focus more on, their bits to settle in the society, and certain basic things which are required for them to be able to pick up, things like when to get up, when to sleep, how much to eat, how to exercise, or look at explaining if you have any sort of problem, and then how to explain those problems to your parents, or to your teachers. And this tends to be more of developing the social side of things at this stage. Then the same bit repeats, but we are going to be looking at adolescence in this case, between the age group of 10 to 18. And here there are lots of physical developments happening. You would generally see most parts of your body physically developing. And this is where we also term this as puberty. So there are changes which happen typically in a female body. There are changes which happen predominantly in the male body, and they are summarized here. So for example, physical appearances would tend to change. You boys could develop facial hair. You could see. You could have reached your let's say your height, the adult height, or the height that you would have. Essentially, your body grows to a certain height, and that would, at some stage at the age of 16 to 18, stop. You physically will be, your body will physically start and stop growing in terms of height and muscular structure, and you would by this time have all the let's say, not all, but basically have what is would be your physical mass in terms of all your body organs and other bits are fully grown. And then at this stage, what we also say during in some cases, we also hear that the reaction generally for teenagers at this age, they go through a time wherein body hormones are changing, your circadian cycle is changing to a certain extent. So in females, you have the development of estrogen, which allows physical features to be developed, things like breasts, enlargement in terms of certain body features. In the case of men, it tends to be testosterone, which will look at making them more aggressive. The voice generally tends to become a bit hoarse, or deep. And it also leads to the changes in terms of physical development from a point of view of the body itself. And this is what you'll pretty much retain during most of your adulthood, in terms of your adult life. And your body is now fully prepared, and you are going to be moving from pretty much having the same body through your, I would say, adult lifespan up until your old age. And this would be reflective of most of the changes physically which happen within the human body. Emotionally and intellectually, you will be going through other changes. So intellectually, you are at a stage wherein you go into high school to a certain extent. You're picking up your areas. You're looking at developing complex, let's put it this way, knowledge, which will allow you to look at problems, complex problems, and to a certain extent, your mind is then able to make independent decisions. It is able to, let's say, research. It is able to take inputs and then collate all those inputs. And you are at a phase in life wherein you are starting to make decisions. You are at a stage in your life wherein your brain, and because of the development of the activity in and around your brain, the environment that you're in, the school that you've gone to, and the inputs that your brain is getting, you're able to then start looking at dealing with complex situations. It could be looking at further improving your skills. It could be developing reasoning skills. Some people develop it early, some keep developing it during this period. and they slowly and gradually develop reasoning skills. You would also look at, you become more self-aware and self-conscious of your body, and obviously people in and around you, and they would essentially be helping you shape up your personality in terms of how you react, how you for example, act in a particular situation, and they will all tend to be related to your intellectual activity. Emotional side of things, is a process, and it's something which is a developmental process. You would definitely be experiencing lots of things that you go through. In some cases, you would generally see that, specifically in the case of girls, you'll have the menses or the menstrual cycle, which actually starts, which makes females much more aware and much more conscious of their emotional well-being. There is this concept of nurture versus nature, which tends to give you a sense of, okay, this is something that I'm born with, this is something that I can do and inherit, or maybe make these changes to bring across that development into my personality. And these tend to be then related to changes which are predominantly going to happen, or you're going to be experiencing predominantly from a point of view of your emotional side of development in the adolescence age. Now, when we talk about adolescence, we are also going to be looking at a lot of different things which will be helping us to seek and find an identity. We are going to be trying to fit into the world. Sometimes you get to hear these statements or sentences, or people saying that, no, I don't fit here, or I don't like being with children. At this age, you're neither considered an adult, you're neither considered a child, and sometimes you see people have difficulty in terms of understanding and working with teenagers, because this particular stage of adolescence is a stage of development in which we say that they are undergoing a lot of changes. Your body is undergoing a lot of changes, and that's why it's also called puberty. And in some cases, because of the raging hormones is a term which we also use, we generally see that it is sometimes very difficult for people, or humans within this age group, to fit either between sitting or mingling with children, or sitting and mingling with adults, because of the changes which are happening in the body, physically, emotionally, and mentally. You would generally see that here is where this phase of development of human tends to be quite tricky. And that is where parents step in and obviously help them understand, to how to deal with some of these, let's say, the changes which are happening in your body. And they tend to be physical changes, they tend to be, emotional changes, and obviously they will have an impact on how, teenagers, in this case, let's say humans, when I say the term adolescents or puberty or teenagers, would be at a stage wherein they are either very close to somebody, they are forming a lot of friendships, or they do not like somebody, and this is where they feel that they are a part and parcel of the society, but nobody tends to understand them. So in this case, it is more about making the transition from being a child, from infancy to a childhood to a teenager, and going into what is called the adulthood. The last bit that we are looking at in the fourth stage is the adulthood. So here in adulthood, we can look at these pies: physical, intellectual, emotional, and social changes, but we can also classify them into four broad types. So in adulthood, you have early adulthood, you have middle adulthood, you have late adulthood, which is old age, and essentially finally you have old age, which is the fourth part. Now in this stage, the stages could be primarily changes when you start looking at, say, for example, working. You start your work life, you start working in a company, in an organization. You are more clear about some of the objectives. You start to have needs in terms of having or earning money, having or owning things, and that tends to be the side of things which people follow through in the early adulthood. Now that part of the adulthood is focused also on physiological development in terms of as an individual, wherein you're probably looking at also seeking intimacy. Physiologically, you're looking at avoiding isolation. You're also looking at, let's say, experiencing maybe parenthood in some cases between the age of 19 to 35. That is what I would class as early adulthood. And in some cases, you would also be, looking at dealing, working, mingling with individuals to gain wisdom, to look at gaining experience at your place of work, building your career. You're also looking at, in some cases, looking at searching for a partner. And in some cases, you're going to be also looking at understanding your physical environment around you so that you're able to, work well and obviously, come out on top as far as, ambition is concerned. In the middle adulthood, we'll be basically looking at late 30s to the 40s. Here, physiologically, you're at a stage wherein you're looking to complete work. You're looking at primarily to have an impact in terms of, income and what you bring to your family in and around you, in particular, extended family. You are going to be looking at from a point of view of what is the purpose of your life. You realize that, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that. So it's more about discovering an introspection when you're in the early 40s. And at this stage, what you're looking at is, sometimes we also say, and we looked at in that video, that people talk about dealing with family, friends, parents, children, job, and sometimes we use the term midlife crisis. And this is because they're trying to find a balance between what they can do physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially, and how they can, satisfy each part of their interactions, having those interactions with different sets of people which are important in their life. And then we talk about, late adulthood, and this tends to be when you're looking at, when you reach the age of 60 or beyond, and then it lasts, till you die. So obviously here, a great amount of time is spent on reflecting on your life. You're more interested in obviously sharing your experiences with your children, your grandchildren. You're looking at, you're at some stage, you're dependent on your children physically, in terms of, because you might have certain illnesses, your body, your bones, your joints ache, and, you need medication, you need help. And you generally see at this age, it's more about sharing your feelings, sharing your experience. And, it is more about having an impact that you can leave on your children, on your extended family. And that is where it tends to be more more involved in terms of socially and emotionally. So you are more in the phase of actually sharing your experiences and wisdom that you've gained over the years when you've worked, or when you've interacted with a lot of different types of people. And it is about needing physical help to a certain extent, dealing with old age, and in some cases medication. And you could be battling, say for example, illnesses or diseases, and that would require cure and medication. And this tends to be, physically, if I see, you'll probably have a loss of hair, you'll experience loss of hair, which will start happening, say for example, from middle adulthood. You'll probably look at, in the late adulthood, it could be, falling off your teeth, or, we see your skin becoming frail, wrinkled. You could probably see the hair color turning totally white. So these are physical signs of how your body would be showing that you are in this part of the, development phase of, your adulthood. And in some cases, you would also have, because at this time of your age, your hormones levels drop. So you need medication to be, to basically keep your body running and functioning. And exercise becomes, important. But when you look at early adulthood and you look at late adulthood, early adulthood, you'll be active, you'll be having an active life. You would go into maybe an exercise and go into gyms. Middle adulthood, probably, a lot of responsibilities with family. kids, work, and otherwise, say, for example, your parents or extended family. So some of these physical activities tend to decrease. And that is where you would see that what we need to be able to do is, when we talk about these 4 different phases, we are looking at essentially capturing some of these bits, which are primarily going to be, related to changes that we experience when we talk about, the development of human body in particular across these 4 broad phases that we identify. So the main aspect of this would be to try and read through and also capture some of the main points, which are changes that we would go through in these 4 phases: infancy to childhood, which is phase 1, adolescence. Then we look at, adulthood, and then late adulthood, which is predominantly anything beyond 65 plus, and you're in your old age. So if we have to understand learning outcome 1, and we have to understand, say, for example, the different stages of growth and development throughout the human lifespan, we are basically focusing on these 4, and we are looking at understanding how these 4 phases, when you go through, influence your physical, aspects of it, in terms of what physical milestones you achieve in each of these stages. You're looking at understanding what are the intellectual milestones, the social milestones, and the emotional milestones that you end up achieving during each of these phases that the human body goes through from a point of view of growth and development. Now, these stages are quite distinct, and obviously they are distinct because we need to be able to understand how the growth happens during these distinct stages that the body and the humans grow and go through. And they have to be classified into, and their understanding has to be done primarily by understanding these 4 broad factors: physical, intellectual, we're looking at emotional, and social aspects of the growth. There could be a lot more, but because we are studying a particular unit, which is human growth and development, we need to be able to look at these 4 factors in general to understand what are the changes which happen, how the growth happens. And the only 4 parameters that we are focused on is the PIES, which is physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. Is that okay? Any questions on the first one?
No, everything is clear.
Right, okay. Now, the second one that we want to look at hitting is basically understand the key changes that happen from birth to old age, and how does it affect us, in terms of our body and our, well-being. Now, there is, in this particular in this particular assessment criteria, we're going to be focused on understanding a bit of going into what is called, physiology, simple human physiology, not detailed. But here the idea would be to try and understand what is nature versus nurture in, psychology, or, essentially then related to human physiology. Now, when we talk about nature, is basically looking at, this bit wherein we are looking at primarily what we get or inherit in our genetics in terms of our genes. So here, when we are born with, are we born with, what are the various features that you're born with? Say, for example, they will be essentially seen over a point in time, but things like when you look at your eye color, things like when you look at your hair color, things like whether you have a physical body, athletic body, slim body, or you are generally going to be obese, or you'll have, you'll have a particular type of body. This is all going to be dependent on your genetics. So what you're born with in terms of genes and what you've acquired over the years through your parents will all be pre-wired, and obviously will be going down, transferred from generation to generation, and this will primarily happen through your genetics. Then we talk about what is called nurture. Now, nurture generally tends to be the influences or the factors that will influence your growth and development as an individual. So here, the experiences that you will have, the learning that you will go through, the exposure that you will get in life in terms of, dealing with different situations, and in general, how you learn from these situations is going to shape up your personality and how you, essentially grow and develop as an individual. This part of things would be generally termed as what is called nurture. Now, when we talk about the key changes that the body will go through from birth to old age, we're also going to be looking at your biological life cycle in terms of, how you would be basically looking at, say, for example, how the external environment will influence you from a point of view of your behavior, your personality, some of your cognitive traits, your temperament, and, in general, your psychology. And this part of the bits that we would look at would be the key changes that will affect you and the life of a human or an individual in particular from birth to, old age. And this is what we want to understand in terms of, let's say the assessment criteria 1.2. So here, what we want to understand is the key changes which will happen. Now, what are the key changes? We've covered some of these key changes from a point of view of PIEs, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social point of view. But when we talk about some of the other key changes, which will mean that what kind of treatment we will require, what kind of, say, for example, body structure we would have, personality we would have, and then from there on, we will go across and look at some of the other bits, which is in terms of at the infancy stage and in the childhood stage, you wouldn't probably see the color of your eye developing or the color of your hair developing. Sometimes babies are born with no hair, but over a point in time, in 3 to 4 months, they'd start developing hair. They'll have facial hair, maybe predominantly on the scalp of your head. You'll start getting hair, and then, when you're 5, 6 years old, that hair was initially black, may have turned to brown, and by the time you reach your adolescence age or puberty, depending on the nutrition that you're getting and your genetics and how you're wired up, if your parents are, having a certain type of hair color, they would start to develop, and the body would start to show that kind of color, which would come up in your. So you might turn and have brown hair, dark brown hair, blonde hair. You might have different styles and colors of the hair. Your eye color might change, your skin color might change, and these are things which are going to be predominantly on the basis of what we get to see, which is your genetics. But when we look at changes which will happen because of the environmental and external influences on you, they will be more from a nurture point of view, and they would be termed as external factors. And these external factors would depend on what kind of exposure you get. If you get lots of opportunities and you get a lot of exposure, you are able to develop a broad range of experience, and that allows your personality to shape up in a way wherein you're much more confident. You're aware of the situations. If you're faced with that situation again because you've faced it in the past, you're able to quickly adapt to it. And in some cases, sometimes and a simple example that I would give you here is, a lot of us have not been to, say, winter resorts to do where it actually snows, or a lot of people who have stayed at the coast have never experienced snow. But if in the early years they have traveled on a holiday or had the opportunity to go from school on trips, and they have gone to a place where they've experienced snow, they know how to, kind of deal with that as a situation. So if you have faced something before, that allows you to deal with a particular situation in a much more quicker, efficient, and in a much more better manner. So in those cases, it is all about opportunities that you would get, and they would be dependent on what are the, where you're growing up, how you're growing up, what kind of, facilities you get. That would lead to the exposure that you would enjoy, the experiences that you could have, and that would influence your learning at some stage in terms of how much learning or experiences you can gather and encompass, and that will shape your personality. So here we are going to be looking at the approach in terms of psychology, and there's a bit of reading to be done. And then when I say reading to be done is because you would need to basically look at understanding how the different changes happen, not just from a point of view of nature, because obviously that is genetics, or that is something that you're already getting. But we need to be able to understand the nurture side of things, which is primarily related to mind, the study of mind and behavior, and they are influenced by what kind of environment you're in, what kind of external stimulation you are getting, the experiences that you're having, and consciously or unconsciously, these experiences are then, essentially shaping up your personality from a point of view of, you learning and obviously gaining, experiences to shape up your way of thinking. And they would be broadly studied across, as we say, through the approaches of, psychology. So here, my session would be to look at reading this particular article, which is on a website called simplepsychology.org. And if you read this particular article, it is going to be helpful because it will give you a detailed understanding of what are the key changes which happen specifically from birth to old age and how they affect your health and well-being. And they tend to be related to mind behavior in general. And that is why this part of it is going to be important from a point of view of studying a bit of psychology. And that would be useful because this will give you an introduction into how these changes happen and what are the various 4 phases that we've discussed, infancy, adolescence, we are looking at adulthood and late adulthood, and they would be across these 4 that you would look at studying through this article. Now, there are lots and lots of videos on YouTube, which you can also look at, which basically give you what is psychology, introduction to psychology. And if you watch that, 4-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute video, they would give you a very good sense and a summary of, how and why is it important when we talk about the stages of, human growth and development, and why is it that we have to take, let's say, a leaf from this particular chapter, which is psychology, and understand the let's say the link between or relationship between nature and nurture. So, any questions on this?
No, as of now, nothing.
All right. Now, we're going to be looking at the third aspect in particular, which is primarily focused on the assessment criteria, which is explaining the developmental norms and milestones. So here, when we talk about developmental norms in particular, what are the various norms of development? So norms essentially would mean we are looking at, again, what are the various key milestones that we will be going through from adolescence to adulthood. And here, we are looking at understanding a bit of a relationship between, each of these individual, stages, and they would tend to be, giving us a bit of an idea into how the body is developing when we talk about and go through in detail about the understanding of, these 4 broad stages that we have understood: infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Now here, when we talk about these changes, we are going to be in the first assessment criteria 1.2. We were looking at the nature versus nurture debate. So we are going to look at psychology and understand a bit of that, which will help us understanding some of the key principles of how we experience, how do we go through. But when we talk about developmental milestones here, we are going to be looking at understanding the various stages through which how children grow and develop experiences. So the differentiation between 1.2 and 1.3 is, in 1.2, we are theoretically understanding it. In 1.3, we are going to be looking at these 4 broad areas. And these 4 broad areas, we will look at classifying them into a bit more detail. And they would include, again, going back to PIEs, which is physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. But in addition to that, we will also throw into the mix things like, language. And we'll also look at throwing into the mix, which is cognitive side of development, which tends to happen within the human body. So here, if I talk about some of these milestones, the reason we also want to understand these milestones is that when we put this into the context of health and social care, how does, say, for example, when I talk about that, okay, if I'm not well, and I have to now take professional advice and seek advice or help from a doctor, then in this case, if I'm in the age group of 4 to 9, how would the doctor prescribe medicine? What kind of things would I be prescribed? Now, in some cases, the use of antibiotics is not recommended because, and some of the medication that is recommended is tested for any sort of allergic reactions and things like that. And they could be done because some medication could interfere with the growth and development of your body. Now, if you were in the age of 10 to 18, your medication and the way the medication would be prescribed if you were not well would be slightly different. And if you're an adult, it would be slightly different. So what we want to be able to understand is that these developmental milestones that we get to see, the 4 broad stages from 0 to 3, 4 to 9, 10 to 18, and 18 to 65, what we want to be able to see is put it in the context of how healthcare providers, how parents, our teachers, people that we work with, interact with, would see it, and how they would primarily be dealing with us when we look at, when we need help, say, for example. And in those cases, we would be looking at understanding these developmental milestones. And these milestones could be having a bearing on what kind of medication I get. Say, for example, physical milestone would be that, okay, I have athletic body, I have so much weight, that is my BMI, and I'm not physically impaired or disabled, then this is the kind of let's say treatment I could get. But if you are, say for example, having a physical impairment or a certain let's say I'll use the word which is underlying let's say conditions, then in those cases your medication might be slightly different. So here, these milestones in terms of how you look, how you feel, how you essentially behave, and what age group or your bracket that you fall in, you would be given advice or dealt with accordingly. And those are the bits that we would need to understand when we talk about these milestones. Now, why are they important? Because of the fact that they help us in tracking essentially the growth of humans across these 4 phases of development. So here, if you're reaching certain milestones, one of the examples that I would give you is that when we have regular checkups as child. So for example, they measure your body weight, they measure your height, they measure and look at the color of your eyes and the way your body is actually developing. This is a particular milestone which GPs or doctors essentially look at when you are in the early stages of your development as a human. So for example, up until the childhood, your height, your weight, are basically taken every time you visit, maybe in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever it is. But every time you go, these are basic things which the doctor would end up measuring up until the age of 18 or so. And this is because they want to look at, are you reaching a particular milestone? Now, what the science has done over the years in terms of the studies, that they know that if you are in the age group of 3 to 4, this is your average height, this is your average weight. Now, if you're not reaching that height, or if you're not reaching that average weight, which is collected with data over the years through research, then it is a cause of concern. So the doctor might recommend that, okay, you're not coming out with your height, or these bits are not happening as planned. Then in those cases, they would subscribe or give you medication to say, okay, you would need to take these additional vitamins, or you need to undertake this physical exercise. And that would be to ensure that you are showing those characteristics of what is actually seen in a particular age group or an age type. Now, if you're underweight, that could mean you're malnutrition, you're not getting adequate nutrition to, feed your body in terms of, because the body is going through a growth phase, and that requires, proteins, balanced nutrition, carbohydrates, and other bits. And if that is not case, you could have a stinted growth, or you could have, for example, develop diseases in the long run and during your old age. And all this has a physical bearing, on how and what kind of, development you would have, or the outcome of this development you would have at a latest phase in your growth and development. So these are milestones which are generally measured, and that is required, from a health and social care perspective. And these have to be, studied. And that is why these become important from a point of view of that at every given stage of your development, you have to reach these specific milestones, which is which have been recognized, and data and a lot of analysis and research has been carried out, and they have been made as what are called certain amount of, it's not an exact milestone, but there are variances in that. So if you're between the age of say 4 and 9, you should be at an height of between say 4 feet to 4 feet 10 inches or 5 feet. If you're growing above that, then you're showing exceptional areas of growth. But generally, the healthcare workers, providers, doctors would look at these milestones in terms of measurement of weight, your height, your physical appearance, and in terms of your speech, how you're bringing things out and how you're understanding things. And they have to be measured, looked at in terms of understanding, and then obviously looking at it from a point of view of say prescribing medication or making changes so that you are able to develop and your body is able to develop during that particular phase. Now, there are different types of these milestones that we talk about, and these different types of milestones would be very varied for different people. So parents would look at it differently, teachers in school would look at it differently, healthcare professionals would look at it differently, and they would then look at monitoring it and tracking it in a different way. Now, parents would look at, from an aspect of things which are going to be related to their own children, and it could be things like feeding, sleeping habits, it could be, clothes, other bits which are important, which they need to provide for, and they would look at some of these developmental milestones from that angle. But when you're studying and you're at a school, your teacher would be looking at a different milestone, and they would be looking at whether you're picking up, you go through certain stages of maybe appearing for tests at a certain stage, like key stage 1, key stage 2, your abilities in terms of understanding your numeracy, your literacy, which is English and maths, reading and writing, grammar and punctuation are tested. And this is to say that you're making good progress on the emotional side of things, intellectual side of things, and this is related to your schooling. From a healthcare perspective, it'll be more of, things like you getting basics of certain types of vaccines, like the polio vaccine, the BCG vaccine. You'll be looking at, things which will help you and your body grow. And that would be the concern of, say, for example, healthcare professionals, your GPs, or, when you go and visit your doctor, they would be looking at those developmental milestones. That is your body showing that, and is that something which is you are basically showing those initial let's say your signs in terms of showing signs of growth, and they would be looking at those particular milestones. So here the milestones would be slightly different for the category of individuals and how they would look at these. So parents would look at these differently, teachers would look at it differently because they are more concerned about the intellectual side of things. Parents would be concerned overall in terms of looking at physical, emotional, intellectual, and social. But your GPs and healthcare professionals will be more concerned about looking at, physical side of things in terms of how your growth in the body is growing. They might also look at certain aspects of, your intellectual side of things. And they would also be looking at, certain aspects when sometimes you go through certain tests, and they would be to look at maybe, say, for example, blood tests and things like that. They are looking at capturing, what are the changes which are happening, so that, from a growth and development point of view, if there are any things which need to be looked at, they would be done using those tests. When I say blood tests, your weight, your height, your blood pressure, things like that would be, more of interest to healthcare professionals. Now, these milestones, we need to classify them in terms of this particular task. So these milestones we have looked at, and if I go back to one particular table that we talked about, which is a table which shows how these milestones, or what are the various, let's say, signs that we get to see when you are progressing between a particular time frame in your growth and development. So when you look at 2 months, what are the physical signs, social signs, let's say, signals that you would be able to pick up, which is showing that you're growing and developing in that particular, age group, 0 to 2 months. Similarly, what we will need to do is when we look at these, milestones from a point of view of understanding growth and development, we would need to look at these from a point of view of these 4 milestones. So we look at physical, we will look at adding cognitive in particular, we will look at emotional, and then we will look at language and communicational milestones. Now, they would tend to be, so if I talk about, we've generally understood what are physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. But if I talk about, say, for example, cognitive. Now, when we talk about the word cognitive, what we mean by that is that we are relating it to something, we are relating it to some sort of an activity which is intellectual in nature. It could be reasoning, it could be complex problem solving skills, it could be remembering, it could be thinking, it could be something which is related to brain function, but it could be, thinking of skills which could be problem solving, reasoning, remembering, and in some cases thinking. So these 4 parts are basically related to, cognitive side of things. Now, when we look at cognitive milestones, what we are essentially looking at is, what is your attention span? How much can you retain in terms of your memory? What is the level of reasoning that you can get to? What basic functions and how quickly can you act when we talk about looking at solving certain, let's say, problems. So when we talk about cognitive milestones, these milestones tend to be, related to, let's say, understanding our ability to be able to, or a child's ability to be able to, depending on, which phase you're considering, the ability to be able to think, learn, and solve problems. Now, as an infant or during childhood, you would probably only respond to, and as an example, facial expressions. So if somebody laughs at you, you would generally see the baby chuckles and baby also laughs back. But if you frown or you give a, fright kind of a signal, you would generally see the face, of the baby essentially just, reaction on the face tending to be that the baby is just about to cry, or they have not liked what you've actually shown. Now, in this case, if I look at comparing this with sometimes babies at the age of 3, between the age of 0 and 4 when they're developing, and if you show them a particular letter or a number, they tend to recognize that. And that recognition tends to be, they understand, and you start to teach them at the age of 4 to 9, A for apple, and, B for this and C for that, or numbers. And this tends to be, what are called cognitive milestones. So you're essentially taking the child from understanding the basic facial expressions to, at some stage, being able to speak at the age of 2 or 3, and then to a certain extent, the age of 4 and 5, starting to recognize alphabet numbers. And this part is basically looking at milestones. So you would see generally the baby only recognizes a face, then starts to recognize some facial expressions. Slowly and gradually, it starts to recognize language, starts to understand you, respond back. And then at some stage, you're taking them through the nursery, kindergarten, and up until primary school, when they start to recognize everything in terms of alphabets, numbers. And this is a journey that the child would go through. And this part would be the cognitive, milestones that we generally get to see. And this journey, which we did see from a point of view of learning process, of they being able to memorize, use language to be able to speak, they can think, and then come out with a certain amount of reasoning at the age of 9, up until the age of 9. This would show the cognitive milestones in terms of their development. Similarly, when we talk about language and communication milestones, what you will generally see is that when we talk to children, they generally might not respond in the initial stages when they are 2 or 3 or 4 years old, because they don't understand their answering might generally be mostly yes or no. They might laugh or essentially cry, but as they grow, you would generally see that as their language ability starts to develop, they start going to school, they'll start learning alphabets, numbers, and they start to develop their speech. they will be more vocal and more, communicative with you, because then they are able to use some of their abilities to be able to, convey their feelings, their emotions, and they would then react in a particular way, and that would help you understand, what they mean, what they're trying to say, and that would be the communication and language milestones that you would see the children would go through. And at some stages, when I relate this to schooling, for example, you would see that the school at the end of the year would have some sort of an exam or an evaluation, and that is to see whether the child has gone through that phase of development, and has that child been able to then, with the evaluation being done or the exam being done, able to manifest that. And what they want to do is cross check whether the child has understood and has that ability been developed over the year when they've been coached, trained, and they've been at the school to understand that. And then their manifestation tends to be as an end result in terms of checking by doing an exam, and that tends to be the communication and language milestones. So at for example, let's say, as for example, then in that case, when you look at the area in which this child is able to just use signs and visual, facial, let's say, expressions, but at some stage they are able to then develop it into language, speak, and obviously communicate with adults, would essentially come into what is called the communication and language milestones. So any questions on this? Okay, last but not the least, let's look at briefly talking about, how do we look at analyzing each of these development areas and how they have an impact on, other phases, other 4 phases that we generally want to, look at. So for example, infancy and childhood, and the development that we go through in this phase, how does it have an effect on childhood? How does the development and experiences that we have in our childhood have an experience, effect on our adolescence? And what we go through in terms of our adolescence, how does it have an effect on our, adulthood? And this bit has to be understood here with the use of example. So what I would suggest here would be the analysis part would essentially, be looking at covering what we've discussed in the assessment criteria 1.1, 2, and 3, which is development and growth of humans during our lifespan has to be discussed here from a point of view of example. So example could be, we are looking at developing physical skills, and these physical skills are continuously being refined. So for example, at a age group of 4 to 9, we can only do so much physical exercise, but during adolescence, we can do push-ups, pull-ups, running, jogging, swimming, and we can do them to a certain ability. But during the adulthood, some of these that we start to do can be built into, we can start doing these tasks and exercises. And as we build endurance and we build stamina, we would be able to do them for longer duration and in a much faster and a quicker fashion. And suppose if you were in a competition, or if you were looking at running a marathon, now they would be